Corrosion, rust and decay. Real metal breaks down in very specific ways. Iron bleeds orange, bronze rots green, and surfaces pit and flake apart. But how do you recreate that in a truly authentic way? In this video, I'll show you exactly how. I'm Nate the Feral Painter, and welcome to the Grimdark Compendium. Painting corrosion on miniatures is challenging because you're trying to replicate a complex natural process on a very small scale. Real corrosion has some subtle textures, pits, flakes and tons of colour variation. On a miniature, the surface area is quite small, so capturing that level of irregularity without it looking exaggerated or messy is quite difficult. Rust and verdigris aren't just a single colour, they shift in tone depending on the metal, exposure and age. Iron can range from deep browns to bright oranges, while copper can go from a blue-green to a pale green. And mixing and layering these colours convincingly can take a little bit of practice. Corrosion isn't just flat, it builds up in layers over time, and painting it requires creating the illusion of depth and sometimes using washers and dry brushing and stippling and a plethora of other techniques that we'll get into in this video to make it look correct. On small models, too much detail can make it visually confusing. You need to suggest corrosion realistically without losing the miniature's form and clarity. In short, painting corrosion on miniatures is all about balancing scale, colour and texture, and subtly getting all of those to work together, and this is what makes this process challenging. So let's start right at the beginning, where we'll break each step down, discover how to get the best results, and as always, I'll show you a few variations along the way. Before even picking up my miniatures, the first thing to do is look at real life references. You can find countless images online, but inspiration is literally everywhere around you. I recently visited the Magna Centre, which is near me where I live, and this is an old steel factory full of unique corrosion, and it's got tons of textures and rust. And studying references like this helps you understand textures, tones, and how corrosion naturally develops, giving you a strong starting point or creative spark for your work. Because corrosion feature rich varied tones, flaking crusts and tiny granular details, that's where we're going to start. So to replicate this on a miniature, it's best to use products with a fine grainy texture. I have found that typhus corrosion and certain rust texture paints work really well, but avoid using coarse products like the AK modes or general ground textures, as they can be overpowering on the miniature, and you do find that the granules inside them are slightly too large for this scale. I start by stippling the texture onto the selected areas. At first it might look quite heavy because of that brown pigment that's involved with the actual product itself, but the key is those little tiny granules. But stippling them on allows you to build up that texture gradually, but keep your placement random to avoid patterns, and think about the actual locations as well. So moving parts tend to be less corroded, while exposed surfaces accumulate more damage and corrosion. For flaky, crusted corrosion, I apply a crackle paint sparingly over small sections. With crackle paint, the thicker the layer, that'll produce larger cracks, while a thinner layer will give that finer detail. But just apply it subtly, as too much can overwhelm that effect, and always refer to your references to guide that placement and the intensity of that corrosion. There's also a more subtle texturing technique which is perfect for the copper and bronze elements and for some of these softer rust effects, but using things like putties such as liquid green stuff, Tamiya putty or other surface finishers, and I do this and I apply it by a stippling motion, or you can even use a stabbing motion, and this will just help create that texture that we're after. But once it is dry, just remember to lightly sand over that surface, and this will just reveal those tiny little bumps and imperfections, giving the impression of early corrosion and surface breakdown. So now let's talk about priming and some base coats. I tend to go with a brown primer when I'm creating rust. The only reason I do that is because it cuts out some additional steps, and it also works perfectly as a base for our rusty tones. You could also prime it in black if you want to and then apply something like Rhine Oxide, but I'll cover a more decayed alternative version very shortly, but for now I'm going to be demonstrating a more subtle corrosion with some natural weathering. After I've applied that primer, I'm then going to come in with some chipping medium. While chipping could easily fill an entire video on its own, I'll just give it a quick overview here, but chipping fluid acts as a barrier between your base layer and the top coat. Using water, you can reactivate and chip the top layer, revealing the brown beneath that rust tone that we originally applied, creating a realistic paint chipped effect perfect for corrosion. Even without chipping fluid, you can simply paint your miniatures, sponge on some chipping using Rhine Oxide, and continue following these steps. If you're working with generic painted miniatures, filters are another excellent way to subtly introduce some corrosive elements. I use contrast paints or washers to shift that colour temperature, warmer tones for one area and a cooler bluish tone for an alternative piece. If this was a figure, you would tilt the model back and apply the effect into the shadows. Whilst I've also got that warm tone out, I sometimes lightly spray around some of the larger chips, turning them into streaks. And this was done just using a 0.2 needle and nozzle, and I lowered my airbrush compressor pressure right down to about 15 psi, and then I'm moving a little bit closer to the model for more control, and these streaks will also act as a guide for later on in the weathering steps, whilst subtly tinting the surface with some decay. Once that is done, we can move on to the first of our weathering washes, and for this I'm going to be using Villainy Ink Goon's Grime. But adding a weathering is essential, as exposed parts of metal naturally accumulate dust and dirt and grime, and if you take a look at your references, you'll notice tons of varying elements all mixed together with that rust. After applying the Goon's Grime, I'll let it dry for around 15 minutes, then I'll remove the excess with a clean, large brush in an up and down motion, mimicking years of dirt and grime flowing downwards. Alternatively, you can use a Q-tip for the removal, or even combine both techniques. For a heavier rust effect, I switched to Villainy Ink Sector Rust, and I apply this in the same removal method as I've just done with the Goon's Grime. At this stage, the miniature could already look convincing, but we can push that realism even further using some oils. Oils are incredibly versatile, they're easy to blend, rework with mineral spirits, or even remove completely. One effective method is oil dot filtering, and this is done by adding a small random dots of rust and earthly oil tones around the model's surface, and using a slightly damp clean brush, blend those dots in an up and down motion as well. And this will just subtly integrate the oils with the enamel layer beneath, creating even more colour variation across that surface. You can also reinforce rust streaks by drawing rough lines of rust tones and using a clean brush to streak them down afterwards. If you prefer, you can skip the oil dot filtering and simply sketch in some rust tones, then lightly blend them with a clean dry brush for a softer effect. But for more precise work, I tend to use a brush just to modulate that surface and the grime to create some unique variation with the oils and enamels, just working my way around, just having a little bit of fun, streaking some parts and also making that grime into some unique formations. Once all that is complete, the final step is to add some fresh metal accents. Even heavily rusted objects often have areas of exposed or scuffed metal, moving parts or surfaces that frequently contact each other, and you can use a medium steel metallic colour like Iron Warriors and dry brush them onto some raised areas, or like me, I tend to like to use these AK weathering pencils for a controlled application. How much you apply at this point all depends entirely on the part and the desired effect that you're going for. So now at this point we have covered basic rust and decay, but what about something heavier like a really rusted, decayed part? But one product I've found is this new AK rust effect. It's quite unique, only requiring 2 products, and the paint contains real iron particles which rust when activated with that special solution. The results are quite impressively realistic with rich textures and varied tones. However, there are some significant limitations with this product. It's not ideal for small scale miniatures, textures is a little bit too large for the scale that we're trying to recreate, and the reaction can take up to 2 hours with unpredictable results as well. They do also have toxic chemicals, so safety gear is required when using this product, and after you've completed it and once you've put all them on and it's took that time to do it, you can't add any additional layers after, because that'll just continue to react and it'll just mess about with everything, and it's not really good. Even with varnishes and stuff like that, it tends to just react it even further. But while that product is fantastic for large-scale projects or dioramas, it offers limited control and uncertain outcomes. I have experimented with it quite intensively, but results still remain inconsistent. But don't worry, there's also a manual method to achieve similar results. It takes a few extra steps, but the finish is fully under our control, giving us the realism and consistency that's difficult to achieve with reactive rust products. So to start this heavier rust effect, we need to start with varied brown tones. I begin with our pre-texturing methods like we did earlier, but I applied it more heavily this time as we're going for that more corroded effect. And starting with a brown primer, I added some additional rust tones. Don't worry about the exact colours, you can literally use a mix of any browns, oranges and yellows, or other rusted tones that you may have laying about. For example, mixing rhinoxide with yellow in different ratios also works perfect for this effect. There are a few ways to apply these rust acrylics. The first, and I wish I'd have done this at the time just to save some time, is by either using a brush or a sponge and stippling those brown tones on. This just allows you to randomly build up layers with small precise dots, giving a textured natural look. Alternatively, you can use an airbrush for a softer, smoother tone, but for heavier textures, brushes or a combination of both do work best, and I've used AK stencils to overlay some irregular patterns, or you could even, if you don't have these stencils, you could even try the Brillo pad method that I demonstrated in my Emperor's Children video. The goal is to simply lay down a foundation of random rust tones using whatever method works best for you. A small little additional tip that I'd like to give you is if you do look at heavily rusted surfaces, for areas that haven't fully oxidized, often have a slight grey tone, and I've incorporated some of that into my base layer for some added realism. After this, I applied sector rust in a controlled random fashion this time to selected areas, and once dry this adds even more variation, and it's going to introduce that chalky and matte texture that mixes naturally with the underlying tones. So for this heavier rust effect, I am going to skip the oil phase for this, and I'm going to turn to Dirty Downs Rust instead. If you haven't seen Dirty Downs Rust before, it's an incredible product with a wide range of tonal variation, and it is water soluble. Results can be unpredictable at first, but with some practice you can gain control using these tips. For this application, I took a different approach. Instead of brushing it on directly onto the surface of the model, I used a splatter and a speckled method. To start, make sure that you are shaking your bottle well, ensuring that the product is well mixed. Then I moistened my brush with a little bit of water, so just dip it into your water, and then I'm going to dip it into the Dirty Downs Rust, and then using a needle or a toothpick to spatter the product across the surface. And you may find that you're doing multiple passes creates some depth, and reactivating it with water between those layers produces some unique colour variation. So I typically do about 2 passes with the Dirty Downs Rust, and once I've done that, I then just do a pass with water on its own, and this will just add a little bit more variation if needed, and it'll just help create that more variation across the entire surface. Another technique that I do like to do with Dirty Downs Rust is to use it with a cotton Q-tip, either dry or you can pre-moisten that Q-tip, and then I found that just dabbing and rolling it, it'll just help create some crusty and irregular textures. Once satisfied, if desired, you can dry brush some steel tones again over some of those raised areas, especially around those grey zones that we originally added, and to simulate that exposed metal. Finally, a dusting with some pigment powders also adds a dusty, crusty finish that completes this effect. So even though I've demonstrated 3 different methods here and 3 different colour recipes, all of them can be combined. The key takeaway is that the techniques that are given you here are tools and knowledge so that you can select what works best for you and the effects that you want. You can swap and mix or layer them to achieve some different interesting rust effects and corrosion. For whatever style that you need, the choice is yours. Just before we jump into the next part of this video, I'd like to take a moment to let you know that if you've been enjoying what you've seen so far and want to dive deeper into the dark and gritty style, then head over to the grimdarkcompendium.com. There you'll find a wide range of videos and dedicated courses available right now, along with course and Villainy Ink bundles. And this is the best way to support us at the GDC. So now let's move on to some verdigris, and I'll show you 3 different variations, and as with the rust, you can mix and match these techniques to best suit your project. The first method uses, again, very similar to the AK rust. There's also one called AK Verdigris. This process is similar to the rust technique I demonstrated earlier, and the results can be a little bit unpredictable as well, but the realism is quite impressive on this one. And you just brush on that bronze first of all, then once that's dry you apply some layers of the activator, or you can even mix that activator with water for some different effects. And while it produces some striking results, control again is quite limited and you can't layer additional effects afterwards, and for this reason I think this product works best on larger displays or gaming board builds rather than small scale miniatures. So my personal favourite recipe for Verdigris uses Villainy Ink, Colia Green and Decay of Death. I start by painting the model in AK Bronze, and once that is dry I apply a wash of Colia Green thinned 1:1 with mineral spirits. There's no cleanup or removal needed, just let it dry on that surface, and you'll notice that Colia Green does dry a little bit more with a satin finish, which we can adjust to a matte when introducing that Decay of Death. I apply the Decay of Death directly without thinning, and it mixes with that Colia Green and dries chalky and matte, and the effect's strength depends on how heavily that you apply it, but to speed up that drying I tend to use a blow dryer, which will also help achieve that chalkier finish. You can tone it down a little bit with a clean dry brush to blend and soften that effect if it's too much, but this method produces a subtle verdigris ideal for armour trim or decorative elements on a miniature. So now I'm going to do a similar process, but I want to create a stronger verdigris effect. And you can adjust this process slightly depending on how you want to do it, but this time I'm going to start with a blue and green turquoise tones, and I apply them really thinly so that that mottled texture underneath shows through. And you'll notice, because I've done that I've skipped the priming phase here, as that pre-texturing that we've done and the sanding will provide enough bite for the paint to bite onto. But once dry, I'll lightly dry brush over with the bronze again, and at this point the verdigris is more pronounced this time because it's stuck in those recesses and we've only captured those raised areas. But I can still enhance it by applying that Colia Green and Decay of Death mix again on top, which will make it even more realistic, and this just allows you to control the intensity and ultimately have more control over the finish and application. So just before we end this video, there's just a couple of key points that I want to recap, and the first one of those, and it's probably the biggest tip throughout painting Corrosion, is references. References are a great resource what we can choose, where we can look at different colours and different tones that are applied to that miniature. We can also see where those grains and those corrosion and those texture marks start to appear, and overall it just helps us understand how that corrosion has formed. Second is scale. It's quite easy to come onto a miniature looking at it from our scale of reference and just attack it with texture paste and build up all that dirt and corrosion, but we've got to keep in mind that scale. So that's why I've chosen the products that I've explained in this video, because they offer the smallest grains and the overall effects that they produce are in scale. And thirdly and finally is remember to have fun. You don't have to follow this strictly step by step. I've designed it in a way that you can mix and match these products and the ways that you apply them. The world is yours and you can experiment, and most of all, remember to have fun. And with all that said, I'd like to personally thank you, the viewer, for coming along and spending your time here with me. And as always, I've been Nate the Feral Painter, and I will catch you in the next video.